For nearly 5 centuries, historical truth seemed unshakable. In the momentous year 1492, Christopher Columbus made the epical discovery of America. This date and the navigator's name were firmly embedded in school textbooks, memorized by generations of students, and proudly celebrated by entire nations as an undeniable fact. However, in the 1960s, this established view of the past underwent radical changes when a startling truth came to light. Columbus, contrary to popular belief, was not the first European to set foot on American soil. The bold assertion was that the New World had first been discovered by the valiant Vikings. The proof, capable of overturning centuries of conventional wisdom, came in the form of a modest but remarkably important artifact, a crumpled piece of parchment known as the Vinland map. Experts who studied it claimed it was nothing less than the first historical cartographic depiction of America. Furthermore, this map was dated to 1440, placing its creation a full half-century before Columbus's famous transatlantic voyage. But is the Vinland map a genuine historical record? If it is a skillful forgery, it undoubtedly belongs to the hand of a brilliant faker. Its complexity and flawless beauty are astonishing, making one doubt the possibility of deception. Some researchers categorically state it is authentic. Since its appearance, the map has undergone an exhaustive series of complex forensic examinations, yet even the most authoritative scholars remain divided on its true nature. If it is authentic, it stands as one of the most compelling historical documents of all time. If not, it is the greatest deception in the history of cartography in a very, very long time, capable of undermining trust in an entire field. Millions of dollars, the reputations of distinguished scholars, and the authority of one of the world's most revered institutions are at stake. Others, conversely, uncompromisingly assert, we see no option but that it is a forgery, a modern 20th century fabrication. From mysterious libraries in Nazi-occupied Austria to advanced space laboratories in California, the intense race for the truth relentlessly continues. Is the Vinland map a fake or authentic? Can modern science, armed with the latest technologies, finally provide a definitive answer to this question? Within the walls of Yale University's Beinecke Library, the Vinland map is still carefully preserved for future research. It was once proclaimed a map capable of changing all of history, challenging the accepted truth of Columbus's discovery of America and elevating the Vikings to the rank of the first Europeans to set foot on the lands of the New World. However, today, access to this enigmatic document is granted only to a select few scholars who examine it not so much for its historical value as for the sole purpose of determining its authenticity. A library representative notes, "We don't take a position on the Vinland map. We firmly believe that our mission is to make this material available for scholars. And whether it's real or a fake, that's for the scholars who study it to determine. If their conclusions confirm its authenticity, it will become the most valuable map in the world. If its falsity is proven, it will be merely a useless piece of parchment." This intriguing story began in London in 1957. Two booksellers, an Englishman named J.I. Davies and an Italian named Enzo Ferrioli, arrived at the famous British Museum. Their hope was to obtain confirmation from museum experts regarding the authenticity of an intriguing volume they were offering for sale. The main part of this book consisted of an ancient medieval manuscript titled The Tartar Relation. The Tartar Relation was a detailed account of a 13th century papal mission aimed at gathering information about the court of the Mongol rulers and their colossal military potential, which at the time threatened all of Europe. The manuscript brought by Ferrioli and Davies had been copied by monks in the 15th century and bound together with a world map that seemed to perfectly illustrate the text. To the east of Europe on this map were depicted lands conquered by the Mongols, the majestic Himalayas, and even the mysterious island of Japan. But it was to the west of Europe that the map presented something utterly astonishing and previously unseen. It depicted Iceland, Greenland, and the New World, a world that had never before been shown on a map. There, in the distant reaches of the North Atlantic, a mysterious island was marked as Vinlanda, where, it was claimed, America was located. There it was, in black and white, and it showed America in clear relation to recognizable parts of the world, such as Africa, Asia, the Scandinavian countries, and Great Britain. There was no doubt about its location. Could this map serve as irrefutable evidence that Vikings had set foot on American soil long before Columbus arrived? At the time, the only hint of this was two ancient Norse chronicles known as the Vinland Sagas. A saga, by its very nature, is an oral narrative. These were stories partly passed down through generations for instruction and partly for simple entertainment. Vikings were undoubtedly the greatest explorers of the Middle Ages. Their sturdy ships and unparalleled seafaring skills carried them far from their native Scandinavian shores across the harsh North Atlantic seas. By 870, they had reached Iceland, and a century later, they successfully colonized Greenland. And now, this map not only depicted Vinland, where America was located, but also contained a short inscription above Vinland, unequivocally describing its discovery by the Vikings. Suddenly, the Vinland map challenged 500 years of history that was firmly rooted in textbooks. I was taught that Columbus discovered the New World, like every other child around the world. And this was, in a sense, a revolutionary discovery, anyone encountering this amazing artifact might have said. In 1957, when booksellers Ferrioli and Davies brought the map to the British Museum, it represented the first serious evidence, beyond the Norse sagas, that Vikings had indeed discovered America. The Vinland map looked so convincing that two museum experts were firmly convinced of its authenticity. However, the head of the manuscript department, Bertram Schofield, had serious doubts. He was concerned that Ferrioli adamantly refused to disclose any information about the map's previous history or provenance. In reality, behind Ferrioli's charm lay a much darker past. He was a fascist who had actively participated in the Spanish Civil War, fighting alongside General Franco's troops. Some claimed he had a reputation for being involved in highly questionable dealings. He perfectly understood how and whom to buy, using small gifts, invitations, good cigars, strong drinks, and exquisite wines. In other words, he knew the price of each person to win their trust and achieve his desired outcome. Bertram Schofield, despite the obvious historical significance of the find, refused to give the Vinland map the official endorsement of the British Museum. Without such authentication, Ferrioli and Davies would not be able to command a high price for it. Realizing this, they decided to try a completely different strategy. Geneva had historically been one of the significant centers of European rare book trade. Here, the Swiss firm of Nicholas Rauch regularly held auctions, offering collectors and connoisseurs books and manuscripts related to the discovery of the American continent. However, despite his entrepreneurial acumen, Rauch would not put the Vinland map up for sale without convincing proof of its authenticity. Nevertheless, it was he who introduced Ferrioli to a young American dealer named Lawrence Witter. This man was exceptionally erudite, fluent in most Western European languages, a recognized Latinist, and his catalog descriptions invariably demonstrated deep scholarly precision. Overall, he was an extremely knowledgeable and discerning specialist in his field. Away from the bustle and scrutiny of the sales floor, Ferrioli offered Witter the Vinland map. Despite the complete lack of proper provenance for this cartographic work, Witter, as he later confessed in his publication for Yale University, was utterly captivated. Whatever the Vinland map and the Tartar relation might ultimately prove to be, I fell under their spell, he wrote. In 1957, Witter paid Ferrioli $3,500 for the volume containing the Vinland map. By 1957 standards, this was a very substantial sum, but Witter understood, if he could prove that the Vinland map was created before Christopher Columbus arrived in America in 1492, he could make a fortune. At his home, near Yale University, where he was then a graduate student, Witter transformed into a true detective. He began his investigation by attempting to date the manuscript with which the map was bound, the Tartar relation. The main part of the Tartar relation was written on paper, and Witter managed to discover faint watermarks of a bull's head on it. By cross-referencing this watermark with a reference book, he was able to establish that the paper was manufactured in 1441. This fact indicated that the Tartar relation was a genuine medieval manuscript. However, the map itself was drawn on parchment, that is, on processed animal skin, and consequently had no identifying watermarks. The question arose, what was its date of creation? Witter's strategy was to prove that the Vinland map had always been bound with the Tartar relation, whose authenticity scholars generally accepted. While examining both documents, he found an important clue: wormholes. If he could show that the holes made by bookworms perfectly matched from one document to the other, it would be irrefutable proof that the Vinland map and the Tartar relation had always been together and, therefore, were linked in time. But no matter how hard Witter tried, he could not get the wormholes to match. He was at an impasse. A year later, his luck unexpectedly changed due to an astonishing turn of events. One of his friends, working at the Yale University Library, brought Witter a portion of the famous medieval history by the Dominican monk Vincent of Beauvais, known as Speculum Historiale, or the mirror of history. That evening, after dinner, Witter sat down with this manuscript and began comparing it to the Tartar relation in the Vinland map. Immediately, he was struck by an amazing coincidence. My adrenaline surged as it dawned on me that the wormholes in the Vinland map precisely matched those in the beginning of Vincent of Beauvais' Speculum, and those in the Tartar relation likewise perfectly matched those at the end of the same volume. As far as I understood, the Vinland map was authenticated here and now beyond any reasonable doubt, Witter recalled. Thus, it became clear that the Vinland map had once been part of a medieval volume that contained two genuine ancient documents. The map was located at the beginning of this volume, followed by Speculum Historial, and finally, the Tartar relation. The bookworms, burrowing through these manuscripts, left wormholes that now served as compelling evidence, linking the map to the mirror and the mirror to the Tartar relation. Witter was absolutely convinced of the Vinland map's authenticity. Witter offered to sell it to Yale University. Alexander O. Veeder, curator of the map collection, sought help from one of the university's wealthiest and most generous alumni, billionaire Paul Mellon. Mellon was greatly intrigued by the idea that a single map could radically rewrite historical understanding. The exact sum he paid was never officially disclosed, but in exchange for what was estimated to be hundreds of thousands of dollars, Mellon, according to Alexander Veeder's wife, set one crucial condition: complete secrecy. He wanted it to burst upon the world, for everyone to be thrilled, and it would change all of history. So my husband came back and said, "You have to keep this a secret and not tell anyone, because otherwise I'll be in big trouble with Mellon." Yale University selected 3 scholars who were tasked with attempting to confirm the map's authenticity in strict secrecy. While they worked, a remarkable discovery provided additional support for the Vinland map's premise that Vikings were the first Europeans to reach America. Since 1960, the Norwegians Helga and Stein Ingstad had been searching the Canadian coast for evidence of Viking presence. In the fishing village of L'Anse Meadows in Newfoundland, they were shown the remains of what locals described as an Indian camp. In subsequent years, the Ingstads began full-scale excavations and uncovered the remains of what proved to be typical 11th century Viking buildings, and the artifacts found within left no room for doubt. The only people producing bronze ring-headed pins and iron nails that looked precisely like those were the Vikings. The Ingstads' announcements by 1965 provided irrefutable archaeological proof that Vikings had preceded Columbus in reaching America. By 1965, Yale University seemed ready to lift the veil on its carefully guarded secret. The 3 distinguished scholars had completed work on a magnificently designed book, preceding the formal presentation of the Vinland map. All that remained was to determine the exact date for this momentous event. They consulted Yale University's generous benefactor, Paul Mellon. In those days, everyone's schedule was extremely busy. Suddenly, on October 11th, Mellon had a meeting scheduled in New Haven, and he decided it was the perfect moment for the announcement. Mellon's choice of date could not have been more provocative. October 11th was the eve of Columbus Day, a holiday dedicated to Christopher Columbus's discovery of America. The launch party was truly lavish. At its center stood an ice sculpture of a Viking longship, expertly crafted by Yale University chefs. As ambassadors from various countries mingled with scholars, Alexander Veeder playfully tried on a helmet gifted by the King of Norway. The Vinland map was celebrated as the crowning achievement of Yale University and its billionaire benefactor. However, the press and certain segments of the public met the news of the map with outright hostility. Society was firmly convinced that Columbus had discovered America, as that was what they had been taught in school, and suddenly they were told that America had been discovered not by Columbus, but by Vikings. Italian Americans were particularly upset, their pride in Columbus wounded. One of them indignantly declared, "21 million Americans will resent this denigration of Columbus, especially on the day we honor him." Do you have children? I have a son, and it concerns me greatly that he will be taught such history. Beyond wounded pride and public outrage, serious concerns arose regarding the veil of secrecy surrounding the map before its unveiling. The authentication of the map is a task of colossal complexity. It requires extensive knowledge in orthography, paleography, materials science, history, and, especially, the history of ancient Scandinavia. It was truly absurd to believe that any 3 individuals could render a professional judgment on all these multifaceted aspects. A year after the map's official unveiling, Yale University, in conjunction with the Smithsonian Institution, organized a conference, inviting a broader range of specialists to examine the artifact. These scholars pointed out strange anomalies and raised serious questions. Why was the Vikings' own Scandinavian homeland drawn so crudely? Why was Greenland accurately depicted as an island, even though it was not circumnavigated until the late 19th century? And perhaps the most damaging evidence challenging the map's authenticity was the fact that Vikings were never known for making maps. Their navigational skills were based on a deep understanding of their environment. They were much more aware of what was happening around them. If the sky suddenly clouded over and they couldn't navigate by the sun, they would determine direction by the waves to stay on course. Unlike contemporaries using satellites, they oriented themselves by natural phenomena. Their knowledge of seafaring was in their heads, and they did not represent their world in drawings or diagrams that others could see. In the Middle Ages, there is literally no map showing any cartographic representations from the north. As the chorus of doubts around the map's legitimacy grew, Yale University decided that scientific tests could help prove the Vinland map's authenticity. In early 1967, the map, Speculum Historiale, and the Tartar relation were sent to London, back to the British Museum. There, all three manuscripts were examined under ultraviolet light. The test showed that the ink from the Tartar relation and Speculum Historiale absorbed ultraviolet light and therefore appeared deep black. But the lines on the Vinland map did not appear black. Instead, they flew arrest. British Museum scientists reported that the ink on the Vinland map was not the same as the ink used in the two other authenticated manuscripts, or, for that matter, in any other documents from that period. So what was it? Yale University sent the map back to the US and contacted the Chicago firm Macrone Associates. Walter Macrone was known as a pioneer in using the microscope for forensic analysis. He gained international renown by investigating the mysterious deaths of Napoleon and Beethoven, and by finding evidence that the Shroud of Turin, depicting Jesus, was a fake. Now, Macrone and his colleague Anna Tiffy applied their investigative skills to the Vinland map. Under low magnification, they discovered that the outlines on the map consisted not of a single line, but of two superimposed lines, a yellow line and a wandering black line or small pieces of black pigment. The yellow line was very distinct, while the black line was intermittent. Macrone asked Tiffy to take tiny samples of the yellow line for analysis using a polarizing microscope. Tiffy could control the angle of light passing through the substance and identify it by its specific way of refracting and absorbing light. On the Vinland map, when light fell on the map's surface, the yellow ink particles appeared white, but when light passed through the map, the yellow ink looked dark. These unique refractive properties became a vital clue regarding the ink's composition. It was a kind of unique material. It had to be something like anatase. Anatase, a form of titanium dioxide, is a natural mineral that, after careful purification, becomes an ideal component for paints and pigments due to its exceptional reflective properties. Investigating this material, Anna Tiffy carefully scraped a microscopic particle from the yellow line on the map and subjected it to examination under significant magnification. For this, she used a transmission electron microscope, an instrument capable of forming extremely precise images of the sizes and shapes of the smallest particles. The jagged, irregular particles of widely varying sizes she found, characteristic of natural anatase, clearly indicated manual grinding of the mineral. However, the samples Walter Macrone obtained from the Vinland map showed a completely different morphology. The yellow particles were practically uniform in size and had rounded edges. Such characteristics served as convincing evidence that the anatase was synthetic, and synthetic anatase, as is known, was not produced on an industrial scale before 1917. From this moment, it became clear that researchers were not dealing with an ancient artifact, but with a document written with modern ink. After discovering these shocking facts, Macrone and Tiffy immediately submitted their report to Yale University. The conclusions were unequivocal. If the ink proved to be modern, the Vinland map was most likely a clever forgery. This discovery threatened not only the careers of distinguished scholars, but also created tension in the relationship between Yale and its generous benefactor, and could tarnish the reputation of one of the world's most celebrated institutions. The world's most valuable map risked turning into an utterly worthless fake. Faced with such serious consequences, Yale University decided to request an independent second opinion. Since the late 1970s, a group led by physicist Thomas Cahill at the University of California, Davis, had been actively working on using nuclear technology to detect air pollutants. This same technology had previously been successfully applied by him to analyze the Gutenberg Bible, confirming its accuracy and effectiveness. On the recommendation of authoritative institutions such as the Smithsonian Institution and the FBI, Yale University turned to Cahill to see if his unique method could shed light on the true origin of the Vinland map. Cahill's method was based on a cyclotron, housed within a massive 10-foot concrete casing. This powerful apparatus used an extremely strong magnet to accelerate protons to incredible speeds. The protons were then focused into a narrow beam that traveled through a steel pipe. When this high-energy beam collided with the object under study, it generated a unique signature, allowing for highly accurate measurement of the quantity of each element present. The sensitivity of this technology was astonishing. In theory, it could detect even picograms of material. For 2 days in 1985, Cahill's team conducted over 100 measurements across the entire surface of the Vinland map. The researchers began by analyzing areas containing both ink lines and parchment, after which they measured clean parchment. In the case of the Vinland map, where ink was present in very small quantities on the parchment, it was critically important to know the precise composition of the parchment itself, so that it could then be subtracted from the overall measurement to obtain the pure ink composition. Therefore, the researchers always took measurements of the parchment immediately adjacent to the ink line, took 2 measurements, subtracted the parchment's composition, and what remained represented the chemical composition of the ink. Thus, Cahill was able to compile a detailed list of the elements present in the map's ink. Walter Macrone's report indicated significant concentrations of titanium or anatase, but Cahill was extremely surprised to find that there was virtually none. It was a great surprise to the researchers that in the first analysis of the ink, they registered almost no titanium. The team expected to find tons of titanium, but it wasn't there. These results, in essence, directly contradicted Macrone's findings. Cahill argued that if anatase, a form of titanium dioxide, had indeed been present in the ink, his method should have detected much more titanium. He suggested that the particles Macrone analyzed might have been contaminated, possibly by flakes of modern paint that had fallen from the ceiling. A small amount of such material on the map could have been mistaken for a crystal, then analyzed, and appeared to be modern paint. Although this was one hypothesis, Anna Tiffy from Macrone's team insisted that her samples were taken directly from the yellow lines on the map. Many particles, she said, were still attached to tiny fragments of parchment, directly adhered to its surface. Thus, 2 techniques, both highly authoritative and recognized in the scientific world, appeared to directly contradict each other. The question remained unanswered. What was the yellowish pigment in the ink that Macrone and Tiffy identified? Was it what Macrone suspected, anatase in its modern synthetic form, which could only mean the Vinland map was a forgery? Or were there other, as yet undisclosed, secrets hidden in the ink? The map's ink itself possessed the correct brown hue, befitting a centuries-old document, and how the scribe achieved such a shade remains somewhat of a mystery. Brody Neuenschwander, an art historian and calligrapher with a unique ability to write in the style of ancient scribes, used his skills to understand how a medieval manuscript might have been forged. He stated that his initial interest in medieval manuscripts was closely tied to a desire to master the art of imitating medieval writing styles. In his opinion, it would be impossible to correctly reproduce medieval writing without a deep understanding of the inks used during that period. The most common ink employed was so-called iron gall ink. It was inexpensive and relatively simple to produce. Galls, which are growths caused by insect larvae on oak trees, were ground into a fine powder and boiled in water to yield a solution resembling tea in consistency. Then, gum arabic, a type of natural adhesive, was mixed with iron sulfate, an iron-containing mineral. The essence of transforming a simple liquid into ink lies in the chemical reaction between the iron and the iron sulfate and the tannin extracted from the oak wood. This process initiates a kind of corrosion directly on the paper's surface. Tannin and iron, when combined, undergo oxidation, effectively burning the outlines of the letters into the substrate structure. Notably, the English word ink has ancient Greek roots, deriving from enkion, meaning to burn in, or to cauterize, a precise reflection of its effect. Over time, this burning effect inevitably leads to a color change in iron gall ink. Initially, immediately after application, pen strokes leave only a faint grayish trace, which darkens within 1 to 2 hours to a rich black. Over the subsequent year or two, it settles definitively into black, but after a century or two, it steadily begins to turn brown. This is why many medieval manuscripts, including well-known ones like the Tartar Relation and Speculum Historiale found with the mysterious Vinland map, are now colored in brown tones, testifying to the corrosive action of iron gall ink. However, The ink on the Vinland map was different. It was not iron gall ink. Macron's theory proposed that a potential forger sought to recreate the darkening effect characteristic of iron gall ink corrosion by applying a layer of black ink over a yellow pigment. Macron asserted that this yellow pigment contained anatase, a modern synthetic material, which would automatically indicate the map was a forgery. Nevertheless, Cahill raised an objection, stating that he found virtually no traces of titanium, a key component of anatase. From this, he concluded that anatase was not part of the ink, and therefore, the map could be authentic. The debate over the Vinland map's authenticity seemed to be at an impasse, and resolving this dispute depended entirely on the precise chemical composition of the ink. If the Vinland map's ink truly contained modern anatase, the map would, without a doubt, be a forgery. The question arose, could a new scientific technique resolve this ink dispute once and for all? In the summer of 2000, Professor Robin Clark and chemist Catherine Brown were invited to Yale University to examine the Vinland map using a method known as Raman microspectroscopy. Today, Catherine Brown demonstrates this innovative technique at Maggs Brothers in London, one of the world's largest and oldest antiquarian booksellers, emphasizing its significance for studying historical artifacts. Raman microscopy is a highly precise scientific technique that uses lasers to identify various materials. Its principle of operation involves focusing a monochromatic laser beam onto the material being examined on a surface. Materials, in turn, modify this light, which then emerges multicolored, forming a unique spectrum. The resulting spectrum is a fingerprint, unique to the specific material that produces it, allowing for the unmistakable identification of these substances. For example, when examining a 15th century manuscript that was illuminated, meaning colored with various pigments, a Raman microprobe can identify each one. Red turns out to be cinnabar, blue is lapis lazuli, and white is lead white. The ink itself in such cases is confirmed as iron gall. Each molecule possesses its unique structure, and, accordingly, the spectrum obtained is unique for each type of molecule. This ensures absolute precision. Researchers either know exactly what the material is, or they do not. In addition to its exceptional accuracy, this technique offers another significant advantage. Raman microspectroscopy is ideal for examining documents because it is non-invasive and non-destructive. This means it causes absolutely no harm to the manuscript or document being studied, which is critically important given their priceless value. Thus, it proved to be the ideal method for resolving the dispute over the authenticity of the world's most valuable map. Brown and Clark directed their laser beam onto the Vinland map. As a result of their investigation, they confirmed the presence of anatase on the yellowish-brown lines located beneath the layer of black ink on the Vinland map. They definitively found it within the ink composition, but not on the map's body itself, meaning the parchment. The presence of anatase specifically in the ink, and not on the parchment, combined with Macron's already established fact that anatase is a synthetic material, could only mean one thing. It was not accidental contamination, but a deliberate inclusion in the ink. This fully corroborated Macron's earlier findings. The only logical conclusion that could be drawn from the totality of the evidence presented was that the Vinland map was created sometime after 1920. So, what did all this irrefutable evidence mean? The absence of any other presumed Viking-made maps. Macron's findings indicating that the Vinland map's ink contained synthetic anatase produced after 1917, and now the definitive confirmation of these data by Brown and Clark. To date, all conceivable tests that could be performed have been carried out, and the current conclusion is, the map is a forgery, a modern fake. But if the Vinland map is a forgery, then who is its forger? Can science help unravel another mystery underlying the Vinland map's history? One figure seems central to this intrigue, the Italian bookseller Enzo Ferrajoli. It was through Ferrajoli that the Vinland map and the Tartar relation were united, and it was later revealed that Ferrajoli was also involved in brokering the sale of the Speculum Historial. Ferrajoli had chosen Spain as his new home, and it is there that important clues to unraveling this forgery can be found. La Seo Cathedral in the city of Zaragoza boasts one of Spain's greatest libraries. In 1957, a scholar was surprised to discover that manuscripts he had previously worked with had vanished without a trace. An investigation revealed that over 100 priceless texts were missing. The police acted swiftly and soon arrested the prime suspect, Enzo Ferrajoli. At a special tribunal, the prosecution presented compelling arguments, asserting that Ferrajoli, using his charm, had managed to win over the librarians, allowing him free rein in their extensive collections. He systematically stole books, not returning them to the shelves, cleverly sneaking them past security hidden in newspapers or briefcases. However, his most sophisticated method was undoubtedly destroying catalog cards, which made it impossible to request these editions. Worse, the absence of records meant these books simply ceased to exist for the library. Ultimately, Ferrajoli was found guilty of theft and sentenced to 8 years and 1 day in prison, but was released early due to ill health. It remains unclear whether the Tartar relation and speculum historiale were among the documents stolen from Zaragoza, but recent testimony has shed new light on Enzo Ferrajoli's dubious past. Diego Gomez Flores, now a retired rare book dealer, born in France but immigrating to Spain after World War II, first met Enzo Ferrajoli in Barcelona. He vividly remembers a day in the mid-1950s when Ferrajoli gave him a ride in his distinctive Fiat Topolino. During this trip, Ferrajoli boasted that he had managed to acquire the Tartar relation manuscript and bind it together with the map. He claimed that certain individuals had owned this map for decades and had specifically placed it in the binding to make it appear as an authentic part of the book. The goal was to bind the map in such a way as to sell the book as if the map had always been an integral part of it. Gomez's account suggests that the Vinland map was originally a separate parchment and that Ferrajoli bound it together with the Tartar relation to increase its market value. However, Gomez's memories leave one key question unanswered. Where did Ferrajoli acquire this map? Historian Kirsten Seaver dedicated 10 years of her life to studying European archives in search of the origins of this forgery. Once she was convinced of the map's falsity, she began searching for all possible suspects across Europe. It had to be someone with the necessary knowledge, and she narrowed the field to one specific individual. Seaver's research led her to believe that Father Joseph Fischer, an Austrian Jesuit priest, possessed all the necessary means, opportunity, and motive to create such a masterpiece of deception. From 1895 to 1939, Fischer lived and taught at the prestigious Austrian college Stella Macetina, which attracted students from all over Europe, including such notable figures as Sherlock Holmes author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Irish novelist James Joyce. Fischer was a recognized authority on 15th and 16th century world maps. In 1902, he published a book outlining a radically new theory that challenged 500 years of history. Father Fischer was among the first to suggest that the Vikings were the true discoverers of America. Father Fischer undoubtedly had a passion for finding maps that demonstrated something first. He was the one who discovered the first map with the name America. He also firmly believed that a Norse discovery of America had certainly occurred, and that the Norse had left records of their travels into the continent's interior. Although Father Fischer never found such a map, Seaver uncovered evidence suggesting he had all the necessary materials and equipment to create his own. His scholarly status provided him access to blank parchment from medieval manuscripts. Father Fischer was an artist who could have taught him how to mix pigments in a way that made the ink appear aged. Seaver even found similarities between Fischer's handwriting and the text on the Vinland map. The Vinland map features 2 types of handwriting, both of which bear enough characteristics pointing to Father Fischer to warrant thorough investigation. But what was Father Fischer's motivation? Seaver argues that Fischer believed so strongly in the Viking discovery of America that in the mid-1930s, he decided to create a map that he believed should have existed. He would not have viewed it as a falsification of cartographic record. Seaver also highly doubts that he created the map intentionally for others. She believes it was, in essence, a private scholarly exercise. However, Father Fischer's private scholarly pursuits were soon to collide with the maelstrom of world history. In 1938, German forces invaded Austria, seized Stella Macetina College, evicted the priests, and confiscated all valuable property, including artworks, rare books, and, Seaver believes, Father Fischer's Vinland map. Hitler's campaign for world domination was fueled by a belief in an Aryan master race, embodied by the Germans, who traced their cultural roots to the Norse Vikings. In the hands of the Nazis, the Vinland map would have become a historical claim to America and a powerful political weapon. If Seaver is correct, Father Fischer used his extensive knowledge of ancient maps and Viking history to draw the Vinland map on genuine medieval parchment. Fischer's Vinland map was then confiscated by the Germans, and after their defeat, it ended up in the hands of the notorious fascist and Nazi sympathizer Enzo Ferrajoli. The first step in determining if Father Fischer was the true forger is to verify whether the parchment on which the Vinland map is drawn is medieval in origin. One way to date parchment is through carbon-14 analysis. Since parchment is processed animal hide, This technique uses the regular decay of carbon atoms to determine a date within a probable range of accuracy. The only problem is that this process destroys the sample. But Yale University agreed to allow a team of scientists led by Garman Harbottle to cut the tiniest strip from the map. This item, whose value was measured in many millions of dollars. So began the narration of a moment that evoked profound excitement. The researcher was on the verge of a nervous breakdown while this significant event transpired. He later estimated that even the small cut piece was worth $40,000 to $50,000. Such actions, of course, are not undertaken lightly. On the contrary, they require exceptional care and meticulousness. Harbottle proceeded, carefully cutting a thin strip from the map and dividing it into 6 separate samples. The very first fragment tested indicated a dating of the 1950s. Believing that such a modern date could be the result of error, perhaps due to contamination or a failed attempt at conservation, Harbottle meticulously cleaned the surface of the remaining samples with acetone. Acetone, which ideally should not have had a noticeable effect on the parchment, unexpectedly extracted about 30% of the sample's total weight. In other words, 1/3 of the parchment's mass consisted of foreign material, a very significant proportion, 30%. After removing this extraneous material, he retested the remaining parchment samples. Instead of the initial 1950 date, the new data pointed to approximately 1440. Based on these results, Harbottle concluded that the Vinland map was indeed drawn on genuine medieval parchment. However, other scientists were puzzled by this striking discrepancy. "When I first heard these results, what I heard was madness," one recalled. One measurement showed the map was modern, and another that the map was ancient. What could explain such radically different test results? One possible explanation involved a crude attempt at conservation undertaken in the 1950s. Another explanation lies in the centuries-old process of transforming raw animal hide into finished parchment, which includes adding a special coating to create a smooth writing surface. According to this hypothesis, someone took an old piece of parchment, dating from 1440, removed its original surface, and replaced it with a new one. It was this new surface that could explain why the first sample, which was not cleaned with acetone, dated to 1950. Thus, the body of the parchment is ancient, but its surface is modern. The map we see today was drawn on the parchment surface, and from this, only one conclusion can be drawn. The map was applied to the parchment after 1950. These findings suggest that the forger took an ancient parchment, resurfaced it in the 1950s, and drew the infamous Vinland map on it. If this assumption is correct, it completely rules out Father Fisher, who died in 1944, as a suspect. Farajoli remains at the center of this mystery, but any information he possessed about the forger's identity went to the grave with him in 1966. For almost 50 years, the Vinland map has been both celebrated and condemned. When it first appeared, it challenged the accepted truth that Columbus discovered America and proclaimed the Vikings as the earliest Europeans to visit the New World. Ironically, although the Vinland map is most likely a forgery, it is now known with certainty, thanks to archaeological evidence, that the Vikings indeed were the first Europeans to reach America. So why does the debate surrounding the Vinland map persist? The Vinland map is still debated as if it were a matter of life and death. It's simply a very natural human trait to argue about such things. The dispute will probably never end. It's all part of the scientific quest, where researchers are interested in getting answers to questions, finding out what is true, and then discarding speculations that clearly aren't. Scientific data have conclusively shown it to be a forgery, but academics seem reluctant to accept it. Even now, new studies are being conducted, but it's unlikely they will resolve the dispute definitively. Science doesn't truly seek absolute truth, but rather provides facts. How one chooses to interpret those facts is their own prerogative. Given all the facts that have been uncovered concerning the Vinland map, it can be concluded that it is a forgery. However, other people still disagree with this conclusion.